On the afternoon of September 23, 2007, the Miami Coast Guard responded to a report from Jeff Branham, owner of the fishing vessel Joe Cool. The boat had not returned from a trip to Bimini, the closest island in the Bahamas, located approximately 25 kilometers east of Miami. In principle, there was nothing unusual about the boat not returning on time. Passengers might get carried away with fishing or have a bit too much to drink and need to sleep it off, often asking the captain to stay out a little longer, which naturally leads to delays. Jeff Branham reported that 6 people were on board, 4 crew members and 2 passengers. It was an experienced team, typically helping tourists catch big fish, particularly tuna. However, the passengers this time were somewhat unusual. The 2 men were not interested in fishing at all. They had simply booked a one-way trip to Bimini. The captain was somewhat puzzled and directly pointed out that a short flight would cost them much less. Why book an expensive ocean trip instead? It turned out that the men could not fly because one of their girlfriends had accidentally packed his passport in her luggage. The girlfriends were now waiting for them on Bimini in another boat. The men agreed to pay $4,000 for the 2.5-hour journey. The captain was still unsure whether to take the job, but his uncle and co-owner of the boat, Jeff Branham, convinced him to accept. It was an international trip, which meant the company could later advertise trips to the Bahamas in its service offerings. Additionally, Jake and the crew could enjoy the opportunity to fish on their way back. On Saturday, September 22, 2007, the Joe Cool set off from the dock. Another very important trip was scheduled for the following day. The boat needed to be prepared in advance, so it was crucial for the crew to return on time. However, the next morning, when Jeff Branham expected to find the boat at the dock, it was nowhere to be seen. It was highly unlikely that the captain had intentionally extended the boat's stay at sea, knowing that other clients were waiting. Jeff called the port in the Bahamas and was horrified to learn that the boat had never arrived there. Since no issues on board had been reported, he found this extremely strange and contacted the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard began their search, and to better understand what might have happened on the boat, they investigated the crew members. All 4 crew members, Jake Branham, Kelly Branham, Scott Gamble, and Samuel "Sammy" Carey, were residents of South Florida. Jake and Kelly Branham were in their early 20s, a married couple raising 2 children. Their eldest daughter was 3 years old, and their youngest son was just 4 months old. Jake had dreamed from a young age of becoming the captain of his own boat, running fishing charters and tourist trips. Luckily for him, his family was very wealthy, and his grandfather provided the funds to purchase his first boat and set up the business. Jake acquired a 14-meter sport fishing vessel designed to handle rough seas. The boat was equipped with everything needed for tuna fishing, making it a top-notch vessel, perfect for catching big fish and hosting tourist trips. Jake's uncle, Jeff Branham, was listed as co-owner of the boat, while Jake's cousin assisted with administrative work. Jake's older brother, Scott Gamble, and a close family friend, Samuel "Sammy" Carey, joined the crew. By 2007, after just a few months in operation, the business was thriving, attracting many clients thanks to Jake's expertise in finding the best fishing spots. Kelly, Jake's wife, didn't always accompany the crew on trips. However, this short journey seemed too appealing to pass up. So Jake and Kelly asked Jake's grandfather to babysit their kids. At the scheduled time, the couple boarded the boat along with the rest of the crew and their passengers, and they set off on their voyage. The Coast Guard disseminated all critical information about the Joe Cool to nearby vessels, including a description of the boat, the number of people on board, and the purpose of its trip. Coast Guard patrol boats scoured the route the vessel was supposed to have taken, but there was no sign of it. They had no idea what might have happened to the boat. Other sailors, friends of the missing crew, joined the search effort. While the families of the crew members were undoubtedly worried, there was hope that everything was fine since Jake, Samuel, and Scott were highly experienced seamen. However, when the Joe Cool wasn't quickly located, an official search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters took to the skies, and a plane flying the route between Miami and Bimini was also enlisted in the search. The likelihood of finding the Joe Cool was high, as the area was frequently patrolled due to its reputation as a corridor for illegal activities, such as the smuggling of migrants, particularly from Cuba, and contraband. Predictably, it wasn't long before sailors aboard a Coast Guard vessel spotted a fishing boat. However, all attempts by officers to contact the vessel went unanswered. As the ship drew closer, the crew saw the name on the boat, Joe Cool. It was indeed Jeff Branham's missing vessel, but the circumstances surrounding the boat baffled rescuers. The Joe Cool was drifting nearly 50 kilometers north of Cuba, about 225 kilometers off course. For a sport fishing vessel, there was no need to venture that far, expending unnecessary fuel to find fish. The mystery deepened when they noticed the boat's 23-meter anchor had been lowered. Even though the water was over 60 meters deep, the boat couldn't have drifted so close to Cuba on its own. This was perplexing, especially considering its original course. The route from Miami to Bimini crosses the Gulf Stream, which flows northward at a speed of 8–10 kilometers per hour. If the boat had encountered mechanical issues, the current would have quickly carried it north. For the Joe Cool to end up so far south near Cuba, someone would have had to deliberately steer it against the current. So someone had brought the boat to this location, and now no one on board was responding to the Coast Guard's calls to establish contact. In such a situation, one could imagine anything. Pirates might have been hiding in the cabin, for instance. Proceeding with great caution, the officers boarded the vessel. But the boat was, in fact, empty. However, something had clearly happened. The chaos that reigned everywhere and the presence of blood told its own story. Wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings were still there, indicating that the people on board had not intended to leave the boat in a hurry. Where were the 6 individuals who had been on the Joe Cool? Perhaps the missing lifeboat could hold the answer. The Coast Guard immediately began searching for the lifeboat. They worked against the clock as time was critical. Lifeboats are built to be sturdy, but the rescuers had no way of knowing the condition of the passengers and crew. Some or all of them could be injured, making every moment precious, especially as the weather began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the Joe Cool was officially declared a crime scene. The Coast Guard called in the FBI, as crimes occurring on the high seas fall under their jurisdiction. 3 days had passed since Joe Cool left the port of Miami. On that day, a helicopter spent about an hour searching for the missing lifeboat when its crew spotted something orange floating in the water. It was the lifeboat. Its canopy was raised, but as the helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades blew the canopy off. Inside the lifeboat, rescuers saw 2 people, out of the 6 who had gone missing. This was not a promising sign. The rescue team lowered a basket and brought the 2 individuals aboard the helicopter one by one. Due to the noise in the helicopter, communication with the survivors was conducted using a notebook and pen. The pilot handed them the notebook, asking what had happened and if they were okay. One of the men wrote, "West of Bimini, we were left in the boat, hijacking, 4 killed." The survivors were identified as the 2 passengers of Joe Cool, Guillermo Zaraboso and Kirby Archer. The men claimed that there was no one else left to rescue. They explained that 3 Cuban pirates had boarded the boat and killed all the crew members. After such a statement, the Coast Guard had no choice but to call off the search efforts. Meanwhile, officers continuing their work aboard the Joe Cool discovered 4 shell casings. This aligned with the fact that there were 4 victims. However, the crime scene was peculiar. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the boat, yet nothing had been stolen. If pirates had attacked the vessel, it would make sense that they did so for money or valuables. But they hadn't stolen the boat itself, the $70,000 worth of fishing gear, the electronics, or the credit cards. Instead, they left behind odd items: an air gun, darts for it, handcuff keys, and even a shuriken. Objects considered weapons, which no one would reasonably bring on a pleasant fishing trip. This suggested the pirates had brought these items with them, but why would they leave them behind? Additionally, experienced seamen immediately noticed that whoever directed the boat against the current had done so ineptly, causing it to run out of fuel far too quickly. Pirates operating in the ocean wouldn't have made such a mistake. All these details raised serious doubts among the officers about the accuracy of the 2 survivors' story. The next step for investigators was to interrogate Guillermo and Kirby. If anyone had answers to their questions, it had to be these 2 men. Both recounted the same story. According to them, 3 Cuban pirates boarded the Joe Cool and immediately killed the captain. Next, they shot Kelly because she began to panic. The pirates then ordered the 2 other crew members, Sammy and Scott, to throw the bodies overboard. When they refused, the pirates killed them too. Guillermo claimed that the pirates then forced him to dispose of the bodies, a task he complied with in the hopes of being spared. He also said he tidied up the boat slightly under their orders. The pirates allegedly forced Kirby to take control of the vessel, abandoning their own boat as they set course southward for Cuba. The journey lasted about 8 hours until the fuel ran out. At some point, a 3rd speedboat appeared, and the pirates supposedly boarded it and sped away, leaving Guillermo and Kirby stranded in the middle of the ocean. The 2 survivors decided to move into the lifeboat, bringing their belongings, and attempted to make their way to shore. However, the neat story Guillermo and Kirby had crafted quickly unraveled when investigators began asking follow-up questions. For instance, when asked about the pirates' appearances and clothing, Guillermo described 2 young men and an older man who seemed to be the leader. According to him, the pirates wore polo shirts and jeans, but Kirby contradicted this, claiming the pirates were dressed in shirts and shorts. Their accounts also conflicted on the sequence of the killings. Guillermo stated that Jake was still alive when he was thrown overboard, while Kirby claimed that Kelly was the one still breathing at that time. The biggest inconsistency was their inability to explain why they abandoned a fully operational, well-equipped boat to climb into the lifeboat. The Joe Cool had all the necessary equipment to send a distress signal, which would have immediately brought help from the Coast Guard. By this point, investigators had a clear idea of who they should suspect, but they needed concrete evidence. Now the challenge was finding a way to keep the men in custody while building their case. First and foremost, investigators delved into the backgrounds of the two men, and they uncovered a lot of surprising information. Guillermo was just 18 years old. His family had moved to the United States from Cuba in 1999, and after winning the visa lottery, they settled in Florida. The young man still lived with his parents. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and had never had any issues with the law. Guillermo was known to be polite, social, and considerate. He worked as a security guard, but had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. In fact, Guillermo had applied to join the police force right before he and Kirby boarded the Joe Cool. Overall, everyone who knew Guillermo regarded him as a kind, generous, and thoughtful young man, and no one had a bad word to say about him. The past of 35-year-old Kirby Archer was far more eventful. His legal troubles began in 1993 when he was 22 years old. He had joined the Army after being accused of involvement in a crime involving a minor. The charge stemmed from the fact that his 15-year-old girlfriend hadn't returned home to her parents on time. In the Army, he worked for a long period as a military police investigator at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. However, in 2003, he went AWOL, absent without leave, and was subsequently discharged from the Army. Kirby boasted that he simply chose the easiest way to leave the military, which he had grown tired of. After his discharge, he settled in Arkansas with his second wife and 2 children, but the couple soon decided to divorce. The breakup was extremely scandalous, as his wife accused him of having an affair with his own niece and fathering her child. Kirby denied any sexual relationship with his niece, but he did not deny being listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. Shortly after the divorce, Kirby became the subject of an investigation for child molestation. It's unclear whether the investigation was connected to his niece or whether it involved other matters, but the charges were serious enough that he was banned from seeing his own children unsupervised. Despite this, he eventually found love again and remarried for a 3rd time. In January 2007, about 9 months before boarding the Joe Cool, Kirby decided to test his luck. On January 26th, he went to work as usual. Kirby Archer worked as a customer service manager at a Walmart supermarket. At the end of his shift, he collected cash and checks, which was part of his duties. He then took the money, over $92,000, and the checks to a storage room. There, he took a new microwave out of its box, placed the money inside, and packed the microwave back into the box. After sealing it, he walked to the cashier, used his employee discount to purchase the microwave, and confidently walked out of the store. Kirby likely thought using his discount would make him look less suspicious, or perhaps he couldn't resist the chance to save a bit, even while stealing from his workplace. Either way, he knew the police would quickly catch up with him, so he fled. Kirby headed for sunny Miami. How did the young, law-abiding 18-year-old get involved with the 35-year-old criminal? Kirby met Guillermo in March or April of 2007. They had a mutual acquaintance, Carlos, who owned an auto repair shop. Guillermo had a strong interest in fast cars and enjoyed spending time around them. Meanwhile, Kirby had been telling Carlos that he worked for the CIA and had connections. Carlos, believing that someone with such connections could be useful to the young man who was passionate about becoming a law enforcement officer, decided to introduce them. Investigators began to piece together why 4 people were killed. The police believed that Kirby, who was facing serious charges, had never intended to go to Bimini. From the start, he had planned to turn the boat toward Cuba. Cuba has no extradition treaty with the US, and since he had once served in the military on Cuba and spoke Spanish, it would have been relatively easy for him to disappear and blend into the local society. There were many aspects that supported the police's theory. First of all, the pirates' behavior was completely illogical. It wasn't just that they didn't take valuable items. It was the fact that pirates typically don't kill people on a ship they're hijacking. 1 or 2 people might get hurt, but pirates generally try to spare everyone's life because word of mouth spreads fast. Every sailor would soon know that encounters with pirates inevitably end in death, meaning that when pirates attacked the next ship, the victims would fight back to the last man. Additionally, the police searched both Guillermo's and Kirby's homes. While they didn't find any weapons on the boat, which the criminals likely threw overboard, they were able to link the men to the weapon used in the killings. Since Guillermo worked as a security guard, he had a permit to carry a weapon issued by Florida. At his home, they found a receipt for ammunition matching the caliber of the bullets used in the fatal shooting. The men were arrested. They were informed that the police had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and the prosecution would insist on the death penalty for them. Fearing the death sentence, Kirby Archer decided to confess. He explained that he had bought a gun, and Guillermo had taken his own gun. Initially, the plan was simply to hijack the vessel and drop off the crew somewhere on the way to Cuba. The accomplices thought they would be accompanied by 2 crew members and did not expect there to be 4. However, the plans did not change. During the trip, according to Kirby, Captain Jake Brenham behaved strangely, so Kirby told Guillermo to wait for a signal. But the young man didn't listen and shot Scott and Samuel. Then Kirby shot the captain and his wife. Afterward, the accomplices disposed of the bodies and guns and headed toward Cuba, but they ran out of fuel. They had no choice but to board the lifeboat and hope that the Cuban Coast Guard would find them and take them to Cuba. Once on the lifeboat, they made up a story about a pirate attack. Since Kirby Archer decided to confess, the only thing left was to determine his punishment. With Guillermo, things were not as clear. It was unclear whether he knew about the plan to kill the crew members or if he had become the 5th victim and an unwitting accomplice to Kirby. In prison, he shared his version of events with another inmate, and he repeated the same version in court in 2008 when he took the witness stand. According to his account, Kirby had initially told Captain Jake Brenham that he had changed his mind and wanted to go to Cuba. Jake, of course, refused, and a heated argument ensued. While Guillermo briefly went to the bathroom, shots were fired. When he ran to see what was happening, he saw Kirby holding his gun. That is, Kirby had rummaged through Guillermo's bag and taken his pistol. He shot all 4 members of the crew. Then Kirby pointed the gun at Guillermo and forced him to throw the bodies overboard and clean up. After that, he started the boat and headed south, but after several hours, they ran out of fuel. Guillermo wanted to stay on the boat with his luggage until help arrived, but Kirby threw the luggage into the lifeboat and told Guillermo to get into it too. There, he came up with the story about pirates that they would tell the rescuers. Guillermo agreed to stick to it because he was afraid of Kirby. In court, he did not dispute that he had brought a gun aboard, but not for murder. He thought it would be necessary for the security work they would be doing. Guillermo believed they were going to do private security work in Bimini, and then he would accompany Kirby to Cuba for a mission with the CIA. He believed until the end that Kirby worked for the CIA and did not know that he was being sought by the police. He hoped that if he helped Kirby complete this mission, Kirby would help him get into the CIA. He passed 2 polygraph tests, and according to the polygraph examiner, he had not planned the murders. However, the prosecution did not believe in Guillermo's innocence, and they had at least one piece of evidence that the defense could not explain. The Coast Guard studied the GPS data on the Joe Cool and found that halfway from Miami to Bimini, the boat suddenly stopped. The engine was inactive for exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds before it was started again and directed south toward Cuba. That is, if we are to believe Guillermo, in just over a minute, Kirby managed to kill 4 people and intimidate his accomplice into obeying him unquestioningly and throwing the bodies overboard. This was hard to believe. Additionally, Carlos, the owner of the auto repair shop, who had introduced Guillermo and Kirby, took the witness stand. He knew about the original plan of the defendants, which initially involved hijacking a local speedboat, reaching the Bahamas, refueling, and then heading to Cuba. However, they were unable to steal a suitable boat, and a few days before the trip, they bought weapons because, as Kirby had told Carlos, they switched to Plan B. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They decided that Guillermo was guilty of causing death with a firearm, but could not find him guilty of murder. The judge later explained that the jury might have made such a contradictory decision because they believed that Guillermo did not kill the people, but was guilty because his weapon was used. It was clear that the jury was confused. The judge had to annul the trial. The prosecution tried to retry Guillermo in 2009. Guillermo continued to maintain his innocence, convinced that his actions were part of an undercover CIA operation. The evidence in the second trial against him was exactly the same as in the first trial, except that the police found something interesting on the young man's computer. It turns out that he had told his friends he was planning a trip to Cuba for a CIA mission and warned them that they might see his name in the news as missing. However, he never mentioned the trip to Bimini. Additionally, he made many search queries with the word Cuba, but only searched for information about Bimini once. According to the prosecution, this indicated that the young man had known from the very beginning that they were heading to Cuba. not the Bahamas. In the second trial, the prosecution succeeded in securing a conviction against Guillermo. He was found guilty on 16 charges. Both men were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Still, the prosecution could never explain why Guillermo got involved in this venture. If Kirby really had a reason to flee to Cuba and was willing to do anything for it, even murder, Guillermo had no such necessity. Did he agree to participate in the murder of 4 people just for the faint promise of a job in the CIA from someone he barely knew? In any case, the men had a plan to escape to Cuba, but they did not account for the amount of fuel needed for such a journey or the difficulties of navigating the boat against the Gulf Stream. Fortunately, their inexperience at sea allowed both of them to be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. 4 people lost their lives entirely unnecessarily. To this day, the bodies of the 4 crew members and the weapon used to kill them have not been found. Room 113 in the dormitory of the prestigious Jian School was shared by several girls. All of them were 17, in their final year, and top of their class. The pressure was unreal, studying around the clock, no distractions, only books and discipline. But the girls were close friends. They shared news, joys, and sorrows. That's why what happened one winter night in the middle of the school year came as such a shock. By morning, only one of them was still alive, and her story is stranger than fiction. At the center of this story is Jian School, but this was no ordinary school. Proudly located in Tianjin, China, it had the reputation of being one of the top academic institutions in the country, if not the very best. Students fortunate enough to pass through its gates were destined for the nation's most prestigious universities. But prestige came at a price. All students were required to live on campus, regardless of how close their homes were to the school. Boys and girls lived in separate dormitories, each governed by strict rules and under constant video surveillance. Leaving the dorms was only permitted with written approval from both a teacher and dorm administration. The winter morning of December 23, 1998, at Jian School's dormitory began like any other. The girls were climbing out of their warm beds and hurrying to wash up and prepare for class. But something was preventing the girls from room 112 from getting ready, a strange smell. They stepped into the hallway trying to find the source and realized the odor was seeping from under the door of room 113, their neighboring room. While the others hesitated, unsure of what to do, one girl stepped forward and gently knocked on the door. When there was no response, she gave it a slight push. The door opened easily. The moment the door swung open, the girl was nearly knocked off her feet by a strong, sharp, and overwhelmingly foul odor. Then she saw the bodies. Some of the girls were lying in their beds, others sprawled on the floor, their hair splayed out, arms and legs twisted into the most unnatural positions. It looked like a scene straight out of hell. One girl was curled up in the fetal position. Others lay as if they had collapsed mid-step. What the students saw was blood, urine, vomit, dried foam at the corners of mouths, broken fingernails, and scratch marks on the floor. She screamed in terror. Her friends came running. Some fainted on the spot, others fled in horror. The dormitory supervisor, hearing the commotion upstairs, arrived and saw the same horrifying scene. Fighting back nausea with all her strength, she called the police. Police officers and medics rushed to the scene. The ambulance arrived quickly, but all the victims had been dead for some time. There was nothing anyone could do. Even though emergency personnel had been informed about the nature of the call, they were still shocked by the horrific scene that awaited them in room 113. There were 7 of them, 7 17-year-old girls, roommates. Some of the unfortunate students were lying on their backs, faces twisted in grimaces, their unseeing eyes staring toward the door. Foam covered the mouths of several girls. One girl, lying on her bed, was clutching a doll so tightly that her fingernails had left deep imprints in it. Forensic examiners couldn't even pry her fingers away. Another girl had clearly tried to crawl across the floor. She had scratched at it so violently that her nails had been torn off, leaving raw flesh and blood behind. Under some of the girls, the floor was soiled with excrement as they had lost control of their bodily functions in death, adding an even more unbearable odor to the room. But the most disturbing part was their eyes. All of their pupils had shrunk to the size of pinpricks. Aside from the bodies, police found fruit in the room, as well as a small knife, presumably used to cut the fruit. There were also cups with a bit of water left in them. The police sent the bodies and the evidence for analysis. determined to find out exactly how the schoolgirls had died. While police officers continued their investigation, they interviewed other students and dormitory staff. That's when they learned that the strange smell had actually appeared the night before. On the evening of December 22nd, around midnight as the girls were getting ready for bed, some of them noticed an odd odor. It didn't resemble the usual smells of a dormitory. It was sharp and chemical. At the time, they couldn't determine its exact source, so they turned to the dorm supervisor. The supervisor also noticed the smell, especially near rooms 113, 112, 111, and 110. But since it was already late, she decided not to disturb the girls in those rooms. Instead, she tried to contact the school administration, but no one answered the phone. So she walked the girls over to the teacher's building, hoping to find someone on duty or to reach their homeroom teacher. That attempt also failed. By the time they returned, it was past 1 a.m. Not wanting the girls to oversleep and miss classes the next day, the supervisor advised them to go to bed. She planned to look into the matter in the morning. Everyone dispersed. And yet, if only they had insisted on opening those few rooms that night, maybe the victims would have had a chance to survive. Surely both the students and the supervisor blamed themselves for not making that decision. But how could they have known? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in a school dormitory? After speaking with the dorm supervisor, the police noticed another detail. Most of the rooms in the dormitory housed 8 students, including room 113. But there were only 7 bodies in the room. Where was the 8th girl? Had she somehow escaped the tragedy? Or had she been taken by the perpetrator? No one knew. The police immediately shifted their focus to searching for the missing student. Imagine their astonishment when she appeared on her own. The girl's name was San. After the investigation had already begun, one of her classmates ran into her at the school sports field. While police were searching high and low for her, she had been freely moving around the school. Officers quickly approached San and asked where she had been the previous night. Had she gone anywhere? San innocently replied that she hadn't gone anywhere and had simply slept peacefully in the room. But if she had truly been in that room, she must have known how her roommates died, and yet she insisted she had no idea. The situation grew surreal. Police couldn't believe that she had spent the night in a room where 7 girls died and supposedly knew nothing about it. They spoke with her for a long time, trying to get the truth, but she stubbornly stuck to her story. Finally, the results from the laboratory arrived. They confirmed what investigators had suspected. The girls had been poisoned. However, no one could have imagined what they were poisoned with. The cause of death was organophosphate poisoning, specifically parathion. Parathion, also known as thiophos, is an organophosphate compound, a powerful insecticide that is extremely toxic to humans. It primarily affects the nervous system. The lethal dose is just 2 milligrams. The poison starts to act within 10 minutes, leading to the failure of the muscles involved in breathing, and a deadly amount of fluid builds up in the lungs. Specialists found the pesticide in the victims' digestive systems and vomit, as well as in the cups located at the crime scene. This meant that all 7 girls had ingested the poison in the dormitory. But how could such a toxic pesticide end up in a school dorm? The food in the cafeteria was tested, no toxic substances were found, and access to the cafeteria was restricted to school personnel, so the poisoner couldn't have come from outside. Surveillance footage and school staff also confirmed that no strangers had entered the building that night. That meant the poison could only have been added by someone already inside. And yet, only the girls from room 113 were affected. All the other students in the school were perfectly fine. For understandable reasons, San, who lived in the same room, became the main suspect. Police took her fingerprints and compared them to those found on the cups. Her prints were indeed on all the cups at the crime scene, as well as on the small knife used for cutting fruit. But that alone didn't prove anything. After all, she lived in that room. However, another group of officers managed to uncover a crucial lead. They traced the source of the parathion to a store that sold it. The shopkeeper clearly remembered the buyer. It's not every day that a high school girl purchases a dangerous chemical. The store employee reported that a ½ kilogram of parathion was bought by a high school student. When the police asked him to identify the customer, he immediately pointed to San. All the collected evidence pointed directly at her. But there was one thing the police couldn't understand. Even in diluted form, parathion has an extremely strong and pungent odor. It's nearly impossible not to notice. Moreover, its toxicity spreads quickly, causing severe pain. If even one girl had ingested the poison a bit earlier than the others, the rest would have noticed immediately, and they would have had time to call for help. The poisoner had to not only make sure all the girls took the poison at the same time, but also prevent anyone nearby from hearing their cries for help. If San was the killer, how did she manage to solve both of these problems? One frail girl against 7. How did she stop them from calling for help? How did she convince them to drink the poison? The police began to suspect that perhaps the immense pressure on the students or some external influence had led the girls to take the poison collectively. But their teachers and classmates insisted that the girls had been cheerful, high-achieving, and had bright futures ahead. There was no way they would do something like that. At the same time, investigators had already confirmed that no one heard sounds of struggle or cries for help that night. It became clear. To get to the truth, they would have to convince San to tell them what really happened. The investigators listed all the evidence they had gathered so far. Tension in the interrogation room was rising. Even though San initially appeared calm and composed, even capable of withstanding intense psychological pressure, she was still just a 17-year-old girl. And finally, the quiet, collected student broke down. She covered her face with her hands, started crying, and began to speak. But the truth she told the police had nothing to do with what they had expected. San admitted that she had indeed purchased the insecticide, but she insisted she did not kill her roommates. Lou did, she said. The name Lou was familiar to the police. She was one of the 7 victims found in room 113. Her cause of death was identical to the others. Could someone be both the killer and a victim at the same time? The police still had serious doubts about San's story, but San said that everything that happened in room 113 was part of a plan by her best friend Lou. Even in such a prestigious school, where classes were always a priority because everything was aimed at excellent exam results and admission to the best universities in China, teenagers remained teenagers. Lou's thoughts hadn't been about lessons for several months. In September 1997, Lou started dating a boy. Such romantic relationships were not approved at school, but that didn't stop the young people. From the day Lou entered the world of romance, it seemed that only her boyfriend existed for her. However, teenage love often turns out to be short-lived. Less than a year passed before the boy broke up with Lou. For her, this news was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. She tried to save the relationship, but was met with an even harsher rejection from her boyfriend. Of course, Lou shared her feelings with her best friend San, but even sharing her pain with her friend didn't make it go away. She couldn't cope and reached the breaking point where she thought about death. The girl asked San to buy pesticides for her. Most people would never agree to fulfill such a request. So San refused her friend, but Lou insisted, wouldn't leave San alone, constantly describing her suffering after losing her boyfriend. San fell under the influence of Lou's love-blinded mind and reluctantly agreed. The girl seized a moment when she could leave the school, found a store that sold pesticides, and bought a bottle of parathion. Lou, having obtained the pesticide, suddenly seemed to calm down. She told her friend that she would drink it that very evening, putting an end to the pain caused by her lost love. However, after all the girls in the room had finished their homework and were getting ready to go to bed, Lou unexpectedly changed her mind. No, she didn't change her mind about drinking the parathion, but she turned to San with an even more absurd request. The girl said that going to another world alone was too lonely. Therefore, she decided that all the roommates would go with her. "You're my best friend. Can you help me one more time?" She shocked San with an even wilder request. This request went beyond all bounds. What had the other girls done besides being unlucky enough to be Lou's roommates? Why should they share her choice? Incredible as it was, San agreed. That very evening, they began to carry out the plan. Lou personally mixed the insecticide with honey and fruit juice to slightly mask its bitter taste and poured a cup for each roommate, except for San. She told her friends that it was medicine her mother had prepared and sent to prevent tuberculosis, which was currently raging in the city. Several cases of the disease had already been registered at school, and 6 students had to go home, missing classes, which could ruin their chances of getting into university. Therefore, all the other students were very afraid of getting sick. When Lou said that her mother, a doctor, had made the medicine for everyone, the girls believed her, willingly took their cups, and even thanked Lou. However, the medicine had a strange smell. The girls couldn't hide their disgust, but Lou waved off their complaints, explaining that all herbal medicines naturally have a strange odor. Saying this, she raised her cup and drank it all down. The other girls stopped grumbling and also drank the medicine, except for San. San explained that she had already drunk her portion at lunch. She watched as the 7 girls, including her best friend, drank the poisonous potion, believing that traditional Chinese medicine would protect them from tuberculosis. The girls didn't leave even a drop in their cups. After that, there was no turning back. The effect of the pesticide appeared very quickly. The process of organophosphate poisoning is incredibly painful. The schoolgirls couldn't bear the hellish pain and began to moan, but San reassured everyone that the pain was a normal reaction to the medicine. When she had taken it during the day, she too had felt discomfort like the others. But soon it passed. San stayed close to her friends, comforting them, urging them to stay calm and not disturb the other girls in the dormitory while sleeping. Incredibly, her words had a magical effect. 6 schoolgirls turned out to be truly kind-hearted people, and despite the terrible pain, they felt it was unacceptable to disturb the others' sleep, so they did not scream. San continued to play the role of the perfect friend. She gave the girls hot water and peeled apples for them, taking care of them as if they were sick. Looking at her at that moment, no one would have guessed that she was a devil watching her roommates die in agony without even raising an eyebrow. Meanwhile, the girls clung to various objects nearby, hoping to endure the pain as San had promised. But even after eating the fruit, their symptoms did not improve at all. On the contrary, the agony intensified. Perhaps they suspected something. But by that time, they no longer had the strength to scream. One girl fell from the bed and crawled across the room to the door, scratching the floor with her nails, trying to get out into the corridor and attract someone's attention. But she remained lying on the floor with torn nails, unable to move any further. The poor girl died with wide-open eyes. The lives of the roommates gradually slipped away in a silent struggle. Losing the fight against the terrible poison, they left this world one by one. Sitting nearby, San simply watched what was happening. After all the roommates succumbed to the poison, San just lay down to sleep as if nothing had happened. Just imagine the scene. 7 girls frozen in horrifying poses in a tiny little room. The air was filled with the stench of excrement and vomit. Even thinking about it is enough to make your hair stand on end. Yet San calmly slept on her bed next to her 7 dead friends. When she woke up, she simply stepped over the bodies and went to her classes. The police were shocked by this story. When investigators asked why she didn't just refuse Liu, why she didn't leave when the girls drank the poison, San answered, "She was my best friend. I had to help her." And there was no trace of remorse in her voice. The investigators had no doubt that the girl's story was a hastily concocted lie. San was shifting the blame onto her dead friend, who could no longer defend herself. But an unexpected clue made the detectives reconsider, thinking that this wild story might actually be true. The police found a note from Liu hidden under her bed. They did not disclose the full contents of the note, but Liu explained the reason for her insane act, and it really was love, just as San had said. She also explained why she took all the roommates with her, except San. The note contained words like these: "My dear friend, keep living and enjoying life. I am upset and lack the courage to take you with me. Forgive me for not listening to your advice and for hurting you so much. Everything that happened today is my just punishment. Don't hate or be angry with me." After discovering the note, the police compared the handwriting and confirmed it was written by Liu. Now they had confirmation of San's story. Still, the actions of the surviving girl were beyond rational explanation. To help a friend like that and watch 6 people die, this was beyond any norms. Psychologists suggested that San might be a psychopath. She was simply incapable of empathy. Therefore, she could not truly understand Liu's suffering. Seeing the deaths of her roommates, she felt no fear or guilt. In any case, her criminal actions could not be denied. On December 24, 1998, San was charged. On July 28, 1999, the court delivered its verdict in this case. Taking into account Liu's note and the autopsy results, the court believed that San had purchased the pesticide at Liu's request and helped her commit the crime. Thus, the primary responsibility for the deaths of the 6 girls lay with Liu, while San's role was secondary. However, since her actions were no less shocking, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. The defendant was dissatisfied and tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that she only bought the pesticide and did not know it was poisonous. The judge immediately rejected this claim, stating that the school where the girls studied was known for its excellent education. As a senior student, she could not have been unaware that drinking pesticide could be deadly. San continued to file appeals, but all were denied. The families of the 6 deceased students demanded compensation. They requested 1.5 million Chinese yuan in total, 250,000 yuan for each family. However, the court ruled that each family would receive 1,000 yuan to cover funeral expenses and approximately 50,000 yuan as compensation for the death of their loved ones. Liu's family was ordered to pay 45% of the amount, San's family 30%, and the school would cover the remaining 25%. It seemed the verdict was clear, and the criminal would spend the rest of her life in prison where she belonged. However, thanks to her excellent behavior and the fact that San was a minor at the time of the crime, her sentence was reduced to 15 years. She was released in 2013. Afterwards, she changed her name and disappeared, became a ghost. The only person who knew what really happened that night vanished from sight. It is said she is married, has children, and lives a normal life. To this day, debates continue about whether San was the puppeteer or merely a puppet, controlled by Liu's dark resolve. But regardless of who planned the murder, who poured the poison into the cups on that fateful night, 6 innocent girls were denied the justice they deserved. Their names are engraved on gravestones as victims of murder, although they should have entered China's history for a very different reason. Could those girls have imagined that the medicine given by their friend's mother could be a deadly poison? But even more incredible is that someone would not want to die alone and would take all their roommates with them, and all because of a first school love. The exhumation was an unpleasant but necessary procedure to solve the case. Police surrounded the burial site at a cemetery in Texas. A small excavator carefully began its work, removing the layers of soil one by one. Suddenly, everyone froze, exchanging tense glances. The excavator had reached the spot where the coffin was supposed to be, and the investigators could not believe their eyes. What they saw could undermine all their work in the investigation that had lasted nearly 4 decades. On December 1st, 1981, at around 6 in the evening, 45-year-old Charles Freeman came home from work and was surprised that his wife Virginia was not there. Charles and Virginia were supposed to have dinner with friends, and she would certainly have called if she had been delayed at work or on her way home. Concerned, Charles phoned their friends to let them know they would be late. Then he called his wife's colleagues. 40-year-old Virginia Freeman, known as Ginger, worked as a real estate agent. Her colleagues told Charles that Virginia had received a call earlier that day from a new client interested in buying property. In the afternoon, she drove out to show him a potential listing, and after that, she neither returned nor contacted the office. Worried, Charles asked the neighbors to look after his 2 children, 11-year-old Brad and 14-year-old Betsy. Then he got the address of the house that Virginia had planned to show a potential buyer from her colleagues and headed there. A neighbor and family friend, Ken, offered to accompany him. The house was located in a remote rural part of the county. When they arrived, the men immediately noticed Virginia's car parked in the driveway. The lights in the house were off and the door was locked. As they walked around the property, they nearly stumbled upon something. On the ground, they found a massive pool of blood, Virginia's blood. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. There was no doubt she was dead. Charles immediately contacted the police in College Station, Texas. The police who arrived at the scene were immediately concerned about preserving the evidence, so they sent Charles and Ken back home, promising to speak with Charles later that night. The crime scene looked truly horrific, an image that would haunt detectives for a long time. There was so much blood because Virginia had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Next to her body lay a large stone smeared with blood. It was clear the killer had brutally bludgeoned her with it. The upper half of Virginia's clothing had been pulled upward, and from the waist down she was nearly naked, wearing only a pair of pantyhose clinging to one leg. The victim's state of undress suggested she may have been sexually assaulted. Her hands bore defensive wounds, evidence that she had fought her attacker. At that time, police couldn't rely on DNA, but they could identify blood type, so investigators needed to examine Virginia's fingernails for traces of her killer's skin. Tire tracks showed the killer's car had been parked in front of Virginia's vehicle. It appeared that they had arrived at the house together, but halfway down the path, the attacker struck. The closer to the spot where her body was found, the more frequent the blood drops and nail marks became. It was clear Virginia had suffered greatly before she died. Near her body, police also found 12 cigarette butts, indicating the killer smoked. Of course, in 1981, that hardly narrowed down the suspect pool. No weapon besides the stone was found at the scene. Robbery could be ruled out since Virginia still wore her watch and rings, and her purse was left in the car. It was time to speak with the victim's husband. Despite the horrific night he had endured, Charles tried to remain composed and answered all of the investigators' questions. He recounted how he had found his wife's body. Earlier that day, he had been at work, a fact confirmed by his colleagues. Charles was respected in the community, and he clearly had no motive to kill his wife. There was nothing for him to gain from her death. Their marriage showed no signs of trouble. Divorce was not on the horizon, and he would not receive an insurance payout. Charles worked as an engineer and earned a good living on his own. Charles and Virginia's friends, who affectionately called her Ginger, were devastated by her murder. She had never been in conflict with anyone. On the contrary, she was always ready to help others, even complete strangers. Virginia taught Sunday school, volunteered with the Red Cross, and chaired a program designed to help international students at Texas A&M University adapt to life in the U.S. But above all else, family was her priority. She and her husband loved spending time outdoors with their children, hiking, boating, camping. Virginia was a vibrant, joyful, deeply religious woman, admired not only for her beauty, but also for her infectious laughter that could brighten any room. She lived to be of service to others, was an active member of her community, and it was hard to fathom that anyone would want to end her life in such a brutal way. On the other hand, investigators began to wonder if the killer hadn't been specifically targeting Ginger at all. Detectives went to the real estate office where she worked and learned something important. When a new client called the agency, the secretary would forward the call to whichever realtor was next in line. That very day, a man with a southern accent had called, saying he was interested in purchasing property. The call was passed to Virginia, and the conversation seemed to put her in a good mood. She told her colleagues that this new potential client had recently sold a house for $72,000 and wanted to reinvest the money into buying a property in the area. For Virginia, this could have meant a very profitable deal. She went to meet him in person, but her colleagues didn't know the man's name or phone number. This meant that the so-called client, who was almost certainly the killer, hadn't set out to murder Virginia Freeman specifically. Since nearly all the agents in the office were women, the victim could have been any one of them. Virginia had become a random target, which made the search for her killer even more difficult. The testimony of Virginia's colleagues further convinced police of Charles's innocence. Her husband would not have called the agency, faking a southern accent. Moreover, there was no way he could have known that his wife would be next in line to take the call and be lured to a remote house, assaulted, and murdered. It became clear that there was no prior connection between the victim and the killer. The choice of Virginia was entirely random. Yet the brutality and efficiency of the crime led investigators to suspect that it had been committed by a serial killer who happened to be passing through the area. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and counted 11 stab wounds on the left side of the victim's neck. In addition to this, she had been severely beaten with a rock and finally strangled with such force that her hyoid bone was broken. However, the surprise for investigators was that, despite the condition of her clothing, there had been no sexual assault. Given that the city of College Station had virtually no crime, residents were shocked. Among real estate agents, panic set in. Some agencies required clients to come to the office before an agent would take them on. Others demanded that clients leave a driver's license at the office and travel to the property in the realtor's car. And many female employees began carrying pepper spray. A little later, realtors started working in pairs and asked clients to provide identification. The city's Home Builders and Realtors Association joined forces to offer a reward of $10,000 for information about the perpetrator, which at the time was a very large sum. Witnesses did come forward to the police, and they were able to significantly assist the investigation. First of all, there was a female school bus driver. She had seen a man sitting in a car near the house where Ginger was murdered. He was clearly waiting for something or someone. The driver did not recognize the man. He was not a parent of any of the students. Another witness, a stonemason, also contacted the police. He reported that he had driven past the crime scene around the time of the murder. He said he saw a car but could not recall the details. In an attempt to help jog his memory, he was placed under hypnosis. Under hypnosis, the witness recalled stopping at a stop sign and seeing a car parked in front of Virginia's vehicle. It was a dirty white Mustang. The driver had his arm hanging out the window with long hair and glasses. When the hypnotist asked him to describe the car more closely, the witness provided a partial license plate number. Both witnesses also helped create 2 composite sketches, which the police shared with the media. Despite a number of calls from townspeople who believed they had recognized the suspect, none of the leads resulted in a breakthrough in the case. Investigators remained at a dead end until June 1983, when convicted killer Henry Lee Lucas made a shocking statement as he left the courthouse. he admitted to killing 100 women in Texas alone. When the detectives working on Virginia's case dug deeper, they noticed frightening similarities between his crimes and Ginger's murder. Henry Lee Lucas preferred to stab and strangle his victims. 2 years earlier, at the time of Ginger's death, he had been in Texas and could have been in College Station. The detectives did not waste time and questioned Henry. When shown a photograph of Ginger, he claimed to remember stabbing her in the neck. Since this matched the manner in which Virginia had been killed, the investigators decided to take the suspect to the crime scene to confirm whether he was telling the truth. Henry was supposed to direct the driver of the car to the house near which he had killed Virginia. The detectives neither prompted him nor gave any hints, chatting casually to avoid revealing that they were close to the location. They drove past the house where the crime occurred, and Henry did not even twitch an eyebrow. It became clear that he had deceived them, but he had a reasonable motive. In Texas, executions are not delayed for long, so he hoped that as long as law enforcement needed him, his sentence execution would be postponed. Henry was eliminated from the list of suspects, and unfortunately, the police had no other leads. Years passed, the media had long stopped mentioning the case, and the detectives didn't know what else they could have done. Charles remarried and moved away, wanting to start over, far from all the painful memories. However, 16 years after the brutal murders of the realtor, law enforcement gained access to DNA technology. In April 1997, the detectives sent the evidence to a laboratory and achieved the first real breakthrough in the case. DNA from the killer, with whom the victim had struggled before her death, was found under her fingernails. The case was officially reopened, and the police began working with renewed determination. In particular, they focused on the partial license plate number that the Mason had provided under hypnosis. Over the years, vehicle registration databases had become far more comprehensive than what was available to the police 16 years earlier. Detectives were able to narrow the list of possible car owners down to 2. One possibility was immediately ruled out, while the other looked promising. The car belonged to a former military serviceman who had been stationed at Fort Hood, about an hour from College Station. However, after retiring, he lived in Kentucky. The detectives traveled to Kentucky and collected his DNA. It did not match. It was another false lead. But the investigators did not lose hope. Now, with the ability to quickly and definitively eliminate suspects, they were empowered. They expanded their search, reviewing dozens of murder cases across Texas, hoping to exclude criminals who had been caught over the past 40 years. In particular, their attention was drawn to convicted criminal James Otto Earhart. He had been sentenced to death and had spent the past 9 years awaiting execution. Before his conviction, 44-year-old James lived with his mother in Bryan, Texas, and earned a living by repairing and reselling electrical appliances. 6 years after Virginia's murder, he was convicted of killing a 9-year-old girl less than 8 miles from the house where Virginia had been murdered. At the time, he was not considered a suspect because it was unusual for a killer to first attack an adult woman and then a child. Moreover, there was no way to test his DNA. Now, that possibility existed, but the police were denied the request because there was not enough evidence to justify it. The investigators needed more than mere suspicion that James had committed the murder. Lacking stronger evidence, detectives had to turn their attention to other work. Fortunately, technology continued to advance, and in Virginia, the Parabon Nanolabs laboratory emerged, capable of reconstructing a criminal's appearance by analyzing their DNA. They create a composite sketch using specific traits determined from an individual's DNA. The police sent a sample of the suspect's DNA to the lab, and the results did not disappoint. In April 2017, they held a press conference to share the suspect's composite sketch. Investigators immediately noticed that the sketch resembled someone they had already encountered during the investigation. They then leveraged the new world of DNA databases, which allow researchers to trace family trees. Using open-source research, they created a list of potential suspects, and one of the names on that list was James Earhart. The investigators wanted to speak with the man, but an insurmountable obstacle arose. James Earhart had already been executed in 1999. The only way to definitively confirm that James was responsible for Virginia's murder was through exhumation. However, the police still lacked sufficient grounds for this. The judge stated that the only way to authorize an exhumation was to obtain a DNA sample from a close relative of the killer, and only with their full consent. The suspect had a son living in Texas. The detectives reached out to him. Initially, he did not want to have anything to do with the case, likely not wanting to be associated with his father. But the detectives persuaded him, and he provided a DNA sample. The very next morning, the lab results came back, a 50% match with Ginger's killer's DNA. This was the evidence the police and prosecutor needed as grounds for exhumation. On June 27, 2018, 37 years after Virginia's murder, investigators arrived at the cemetery where their suspect was buried. A small excavator carefully dug through the soil, cautiously approaching the coffin. But when it reached James Earhart's remains, the investigators exchanged stunned glances. They could hardly believe it. Where there should have been a traditional coffin, there was only a simple cardboard box. Cardboard, essentially made of plant fibers, decomposes very quickly in the ground, which accelerated the decomposition of the body. 19 years after the execution, only bones remained. The detectives felt disheartened. They knew that at this stage of decomposition, obtaining DNA could be extremely difficult. Miraculously, they succeeded. A sample was sent for comparison. James Earhart's DNA matched the DNA found under Virginia Freeman's fingernails. The case was finally solved nearly 40 years later. The police believe that James did not know Ginger personally and simply called the real estate agency, knowing that mostly women worked there. He told Virginia he was interested in a property in a quiet, remote location so that they would be completely alone and no one would interfere with his plan. He likely intended to assault her, but she resisted so fiercely that he realized he could not succeed, and he took her life. Next, he decided to target a 9-year-old girl. On May 12, 1987, a warm, sunny Tuesday, 9-year-old Candy Janelle Kirtland got off the school bus and headed toward her home. Candy lived in Bryan with her father John and stepmother Ruth Ann. The bus stopped at 3:40 p.m., just a few steps from her front door. A neighbor mowing the lawn saw the girl and waved politely. When Candy entered the house, her father was at work and her stepmother had taken Candy's brother to the eye doctor. Her parents returned around 4 p.m. and found her textbooks on the doorstep and her keys inside, but Candy herself was nowhere to be found. After contacting all her acquaintances and even her mother in Houston, the family reached out to the police. At least 5 neighbors reported seeing a large man, about 40 years old, earlier that day, about 2 hours before Candy got off the bus. He was described as a large, unkempt man with an unpleasant odor. After a composite sketch was created, several more witnesses identified him. Interestingly, he had visited the Kirtlands' home a week earlier to discuss buying a paint sprayer that Candy's parents were selling. At that time, Candy's stepmother noticed that the man kept staring at her stepdaughter. On May 12th, he returned to the same street and asked neighbors how to contact the Kirtlands. He drove a late-model sedan, which was seen at the family's house when Candy got off the bus. A neighbor recalled Candy speaking to the heavy-set man in the sedan parked in the driveway. The perpetrator did not even attempt to be discreet and drew attention from neighbors. He also lived in the same city as his victim. When the police arrived at his house, where he lived with his mother, he was gone. However, during a search, they found the Kirtlands' address and 3 newspaper clippings about the girl's disappearance. He was arrested a week later in the woods, sleeping in a new car. During interrogation, James denied killing the girl, but admitted that she had gotten into his car on May 12th. He claimed he drove her to a nearby intersection and let her out, and when he heard about her disappearance, he panicked, fearing he would be blamed. He changed cars and fled. On the same day, May 26th, the police found the child's body by the road in a wooded area. A local resident, out for a walk, noticed a terrible smell. Following it, he discovered a pile of garbage, under which a white sneaker was visible, and called the police. The body belonged to little Candy. Her hands were tied behind her back with an electrical cord, and she had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber Remington. She was wearing the same clothes as the day she disappeared and had died the same day. The gun matching the crime was found in James's car, with 1 cartridge missing. On May 12th, he had deliberately returned to the family's house because he had taken a liking to the girl a week earlier. That morning, he responded to an ad about finding a kitten, claiming he wanted a pet for his daughter, though he had no daughter. He likely used the kitten to lure Candy. At trial, the prosecutor described her as an easy target. In her room, her diary revealed that she was sad because she had few friends. The kidnapper and murderer chose a quiet, lonely, and friendly girl who loved animals as his victim. The psychiatrist who examined the man stated that he had borderline personality disorder. Therefore, there is a high likelihood that he did not limit himself to just 2 crimes, and may have killed outside of Texas as well. He spent a lot of time in Colorado and even told his cousin that he had killed a girl there. In a conversation with a cousin, he once mentioned that he enjoyed hunting there, but he was not talking about animals. This suggests that there may be unsolved murders in Colorado for which James Otto Earhart could be responsible. There is also a third murder in Texas that investigators believe James Earhart committed. They have no DNA evidence to confirm it, but since his arrest in connection with Candy's murder, Bryan police considered him the prime suspect. This case involves 51-year-old Ruth Richardson Green, murdered in 1986, also in Bryan. That February, the woman suddenly disappeared after her daytime shift at a bakery. Her car remained in the parking lot, and all her belongings were in place. Her nearly nude body was later found in the woods by fishermen who were alerted by vultures. She had been shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. The pathologist believes she was alive for almost the entire week she was considered missing. Sound familiar? She was kidnapped, killed, and disposed of in the woods just like Candy. When Earhart was arrested after Candy's murder, he had been sleeping in a car only 50 meters from the location where Ruth's body had been found the year before. He lived near her workplace, and police found newspaper clippings about Ruth's murder at his home. However, this alone does not prove anything, as officers also discovered clippings about other solved crimes attributed to other killers. Male semen was found on Ruth's body, but it is now too degraded for modern DNA analysis. Convicted James Earhart refused to speak about Ruth, even knowing he would be executed. He likely hoped for a successful appeal until the very end. The killer was executed on August 11, 1999. One may wonder why James's DNA was not in the FBI's CODIS, Combined DNA Index System database, even though he had spent 11 years in prison awaiting execution. Why wasn't a sample taken? Because he refused. Today, DNA samples of convicted criminals are taken without consent, but back then the child murderer simply said no, and the authorities left him alone. Thus, the killer of Virginia Freeman was finally identified. As the saying goes, better late than never. But it is still somewhat frustrating that investigators had almost caught him nearly 2 decades earlier. 20 years ago, detectives cast a wide net, analyzing similar crimes and the possible involvement of convicted offenders in Texas. As early as November 2001, police and prosecutors discussed obtaining DNA from convicted serial killer James Earhart to determine whether he had killed Virginia. At that time, they already considered him a serial killer responsible for Ruth's murder, a fact that had not yet been proven, and were interested in him as a suspect in Ginger's case. However, lacking evidence in Ruth's case, he was officially only guilty of the girl's murder, not that of an adult woman, and the district attorney saw no grounds to exhume his body. Had they acted then, the case could have been solved in 2001. Unfortunately, Charles Freeman passed away several years before the case was definitively closed. Yet at least his and Virginia's children, now adults Brad and Betsy, learned the truth. While it cannot bring their mother back, they can be certain that the person responsible for such a horrific crime is no longer free. Three girls, 3 sisters, got into their father's car and left their mother's home to spend time with him and enjoy a camping trip in nature, something they had done many times before. But this time, they never came back. What began as a disappearance quickly turned into a massive search for 9-year-old Peyton, 8-year-old Evelyn, and 5-year-old Olivia. Police found an abandoned truck, traces of human and animal blood, a tent, plastic bags, and zip ties. But not the father, a man with elite military training who seemed to vanish into thin air. A race against time began to find a man with nothing to lose. Can someone who spent his whole life mastering survival make it to the Canadian border before he's caught? By Friday evening, May 30th, 2025, Travis Decker arrived at the home of his ex-wife, Whitney Decker, in Wenatchee, Washington, to pick up their 3 daughters and spend some time with them, as he usually did. But by 10 p.m., Whitney contacted the police because she was growing worried. The girls were supposed to be home by 8, and she had tried calling Travis multiple times. Each time, it went to voicemail. Wenatchee police wanted to immediately activate the Amber Alert system for missing or abducted children, knowing how impossible it is to ignore an Amber Alert. All TV and radio broadcasts are interrupted, highway signs display the alert, and most importantly, an extremely loud notification is sent to phones, startling but effective. However, the Washington state authorities denied the request, stating there was no cause. Travis had never been accused of domestic violence. He had never harmed the children, something their mother confirmed, and therefore there was no reason to assume the girls were in danger. When Travis and the girls failed to show up at a sporting event the next morning, Saturday, May 31st, police finally decided to inform the public, but once again they chose not to activate the urgent and far-reaching Amber Alert system. Very soon they would have to answer for that decision. The girl's mother, Whitney, said that Travis seemed unusually quiet when he came to pick up the children, but she wasn't concerned, at least not until it was time for the girls to come home, and they didn't. Travis had never been late before. He always brought the girls back on time. Whitney tried calling him, but each time the call went straight to voicemail. And since her ex-husband didn't have a permanent address, she had no idea where to look. So Whitney turned to the police. Her fear for the girls' safety grew when Travis didn't show up for work on the morning of June 2nd. When officers visited his workplace and spoke with his supervisor, they were told that Travis had recently been acting off. His emotional state was clearly deteriorating. That same day, June 2nd, police obtained an arrest warrant for 32-year-old Travis Decker on charges of custodial interference. Using automatic license plate recognition technology, authorities learned that at 5:41 p.m. on Friday, shortly after picking the girls up, Travis's vehicle had been headed north across the Wenatchee River Bridge. Police focused all efforts in that direction, while officers also began digging deeper into Travis's background. They learned that Travis and Whitney got married after he returned to the U.S. from Afghanistan. Several generations of Decker men had served in the military, and Travis had likely always known he would follow in their footsteps. As a child, he was athletic, and after graduating high school, he enlisted in the Army. He completed basic combat training and advanced individual training to become an infantryman, one of the most dangerous and physically demanding roles in the military. Just a year later, he was deployed to Afghanistan, where he remained until 2014, undertaking a variety of dangerous missions. In other words, Travis spent years training and practicing how to survive in hostile environments, in the wilderness, often without supplies. He knew how to evade pursuit, think strategically. He knew how to disappear. Unfortunately, it was during that time that his mental health began to deteriorate. He returned to the U.S. not only with medals, but also suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Still, it didn't stop him from becoming a husband and the father of 3 beautiful daughters. Back in the U.S., Travis joined the National Guard. The family lived in Wenatchee, a small town in the heart of Washington state, where the Columbia and Wenatchee rivers meet. The couple was married for 7 years, and in the beginning, they were very happy. Travis deeply loved Whitney and the girls, spent all his free time with them, took them to events, and cared for and protected them in every way. According to Whitney, he had never been aggressive or cruel. He never even raised his voice at them. However, his mental health issues became more noticeable over time. Sometimes he would leave in the middle of the night or wake Whitney up with his screaming. He tried multiple times to get help, but according to Whitney, it's incredibly difficult for U.S. veterans to access proper support in their own country. Eventually, Whitney couldn't take it anymore. She filed for divorce on November 14, 2022. Of course, the divorce couldn't be pleasant for the family, but it proceeded in a very civil manner. Neither spouse blamed the other for anything. They simply agreed that separating was the best decision for them and wanted to make sure it wouldn't negatively affect their daughters. According to their agreement, Travis would pick up the girls every other weekend and spend time with them from 6 p.m. on Friday until 6 p.m. on Sunday. Whitney never worried about the children's safety while they were with their father. She was confident they had a good time and that Travis adored them. But by September 2024, she began to question whether Travis was providing the girls with proper living conditions while they were with him. Here's what happened. A month after the divorce, Travis moved into the Wenatchee National Guard Armory building. Despite its name, the building doesn't only store weapons, there are also sleeping barracks. It's not a suitable place for permanent residents, of course, but officers can temporarily stay there as part of an informal arrangement. Travis was allowed to live there for a while, and he actually stayed just a couple of months before moving into an apartment in Wenatchee. However, when the lease ended, he chose not to renew it and returned to the Armory building. Whitney was shocked to find out that her 3 young daughters had been living in such conditions, sleeping on mattresses. She told her ex-husband openly that she was uncomfortable with the idea of the girls spending nights near unfamiliar men. Of course, she wasn't accusing anyone directly, but pointed out that someone could have bad intentions. Anything could happen. After all, Travis couldn't keep an eye on them 24/7. He might be called away or need to sleep himself. A mother's imagination painted terrifying images of what could happen to her daughters, especially since there had already been one incident. On December 19, 2023, while the girls were with their father, Whitney received a video call from their youngest, Olivia. The little girl was crying and screaming. It turned out that she and Peyton had been playing with a back extension machine, and Peyton accidentally dropped weight plates on her sister's fingers. Travis had been outside with the dogs and hadn't seen what was going on, and now he wasn't even comforting them. Peyton had to go find him to explain what had happened. Whitney was also concerned that her ex-husband loved camping and often took the girls with him. In general, she didn't object to such activities, but she didn't always like it when Travis took the girls camping, regardless of the weather. Considering all of this, on September 20th, 2024, Whitney and her divorce attorney filed a request to modify Travis's visitation rights. It wasn't an easy decision for Whitney. She always tried to be fair to her ex. She wasn't one of those women who blamed their former spouses for everything or criticized every move. No, she gave him credit. She acknowledged that he was actively involved in their daughters' lives, was there when they needed him, and he loved them, and they loved him back. But near the end of their marriage, Travis was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and Whitney believed he had stopped taking the medication prescribed to help manage it. She said that over time, Travis's behavior became increasingly strange. For example, once a stranger drove him to her house, and Travis asked to spend time with the girls in her basement. On another occasion, Travis didn't want to pick up the girls at all, saying they were trying not to upset him because they had seen him training his dogs and clearly hadn't liked it. Maybe they were even scared. In other words, it became clear that after the divorce, Travis was struggling to maintain stability in his life. Alongside housing issues, he had problems with work. First, he asked to be moved to part-time hours. Later, he stopped showing up at the National Guard entirely. He had to take on odd jobs to support himself. Travis himself admitted that he used to earn $86,000 a year in the National Guard, and now he was making about $38,000. The fact that he walked away from a military career was shocking. Travis had considered it his calling, a family tradition. That's why Whitney had to ask the court first to order a full psychiatric evaluation for Travis to determine whether he had other potential health issues. And second, that he not be allowed to keep the girls overnight until his housing situation improved. Once Travis secured stable housing, Whitney was clearly willing to resume overnight visits. The judge agreed with her. From then on, Travis could spend weekends with the girls, but without overnight stays. These were the custody terms in place on Friday, May 30th, 2025, when Travis took the children from their mother's home. Meanwhile, the search for the man and his daughters continued. And on June 2nd at 3:45 p.m., a patrol officer discovered Travis's vehicle, a white 2017 GMC Sierra pickup, abandoned near a campground called Rock Island, close to Leavenworth. Officers from the Wenatchee Police Department immediately rushed to the site. Approximately 70 to 90 meters from Travis's truck, on a small embankment, they found the bodies of the three girls. All three were discovered with plastic bags over their heads. Their wrists were bound with zip ties, presumably to prevent them from removing the bags. According to a preliminary report from the medical examiner, all three girls died from asphyxiation. The public still doesn't know exactly how the murders were carried out. Were the victims killed all at once? Or did the perpetrator murder them one by one, leaving the last child to watch in terror as her sisters died? Did the killer observe their suffering? Or did he leave, unable to bear the sight of them fighting desperately for each breath? Of course, none of these scenarios is any less horrific than the others, because the result is the same. 9-year-old Peyton, 8-year-old Evelyn, and 5-year-old Olivia are dead, and they will never return home to their mother. Plastic bags and zip ties were scattered near the bodies. On the tailgate of Travis's truck, forensic investigators found 2 bloody prints. Sheriff Mike Morrison later explained that the blood belonged to a man, most likely Travis, and also to a dog, presumably Travis's own. However, the sheriff stressed that the dog was unharmed. In fact, while officers were working at the crime scene, the dog calmly and gently approached them. She was later turned over to staff at the Humane Society. At the scene, police also discovered a tent and a recently extinguished campfire. Suspicion quickly fell on Travis, if only because he was nowhere to be found. His personal belongings, including his wallet, food, and blankets, were left in the vehicle. Investigators tracked Travis's phone and discovered that he had been in the area on Thursday, May 29th, the day before he picked up the girls. When it became clear that the girls were dead and Travis had become the prime suspect, police spoke again with the children's mother. Whitney noted that on the evening her ex-husband came to pick up the girls, he was unusually quiet. But aside from that, everything seemed normal. Even if something had felt off, she might have dismissed it as part of the emotional instability Travis had long struggled with. She assured officers that she had never before worried about the girls' safety when they were with their father. He never hurt her during their marriage, and he never showed aggression toward the children. He wasn't cruel, harsh, or even raised his voice at them. For her part, she always tried to be understanding of his mental health, knowing what he had endured during his time in Afghanistan. However, when journalists spoke with her neighbor, Bin Yin, who claimed to be a friend of the family, he painted a somewhat different picture of the Deckers' home life. Bin recalled that when he first met Travis, he was a strong, fit man, clean-shaven, confident, and a former soldier who had joined the National Guard. But after Travis moved out of the family home, his appearance began to change, as if reflecting the shifts happening inside him. Bin often saw him when Travis came to pick up the girls. The former serviceman had deteriorated significantly. He had lost weight, stopped shaving, and his hair had grown out. It didn't look like a style choice. It looked like someone who had stopped taking care of himself. On May 30th, when Travis came to pick up his daughters, Bin exchanged a few words with him. According to the neighbor, Travis seemed very sad. During the short conversation, he repeated the same questions, as if forgetting he had already asked them. Bin found this strange, though he was aware Travis had mental health issues. But the most striking thing Bin told the reporters was that Whitney had once confided in him that Travis had hit her. It was these emotional outbursts, he said, that ultimately led to the divorce. It's unlikely Bin would lie to journalists knowing Whitney might hear what he said. Still, we can only guess what the true dynamics of the family were. In any case, Whitney never believed Travis would hurt the children. So even if he had been abusive toward her, she may have chosen not to bring that up in court for fear that a judge would limit Travis's ability to see the girls. She understood what was going on in his mind, what had made him this way. And God knows she tried everything she could to ensure he remained an important part of their daughters' lives. After the girls' bodies were discovered, a judge issued a warrant for the arrest of Travis Decker on charges of triple homicide and 3 counts of kidnapping. An extensive manhunt for the suspect began in the Wenatchee Mountains. According to Sheriff Mike Morrison, this is one of the largest search operations ever conducted in the region. A wide array of agencies and organizations were brought in. Dozens of officers are combing the difficult terrain, joined by K-9 units with tracking dogs. Helicopters and drones equipped with thermal imaging are scanning the area from above. GoPro cameras are being lowered into bodies of water in case Travis is already dead. Law enforcement is not ruling out that possibility, and here's why. Unfortunately, cases where a parent kills their own child are not as rare as we might wish. So much so that there are detailed statistics on such crimes. Both mothers and fathers can become perpetrators, but their motives and methods often differ. Men are more likely to commit such acts, and their victims are usually older children, while mothers more often kill infants, sometimes within the first 24 hours of life. Mental illness plays a significant role in many of these tragedies. 60% of parental murderers, especially mothers, suffer from depression or psychosis. What's more relevant to this case, over a quarter of perpetrators attempt to take their own lives after the crime, and fathers are more likely to do so than mothers. But why would anyone commit such an unthinkable crime? It's difficult to comprehend how someone who is supposed to love, protect, and care for a child could take their life. Still, experts generally recognize 5 key motives. First is altruistic filicide, in which a parent believes death is in the child's best interest, to protect them from real or imagined suffering. Second is acute psychosis, when the parent's grasp on reality is severely distorted, often involving hallucinations. Third is the killing of an unwanted child who is seen as a burden. Fourth is accidental death as a result of ongoing abuse, where violence escalates over time and ends fatally. The fifth is revenge against a partner, a motive seen most often in fathers, particularly amid custody disputes or when domestic abuse has already been present in the family. Which of these can be ruled out in Travis Decker's case? If he truly committed this crime, this was clearly not an accident. Acute psychosis is unlikely. He had emotional instability, but not full-blown psychosis. There's no reason to believe he viewed his 3 daughters as unwanted. On the contrary, he consistently wanted more time with them, not less. Altruistic motives usually end with the entire family dead, yet Whitney was untouched. Travis is believed to be alive, and even his beloved dog was spared. It's far more likely that Travis was emotionally exhausted and overwhelmed by a series of life failures and decided to send a message. A brutal, unmistakable message of revenge directed at Whitney. His problems had been building: fear of losing access to his daughters, financial struggles, even telling Whitney he might have to give up his dogs because he couldn't care for them. Perhaps in his mind, she hadn't supported him, even though in reality, Whitney had stood by him more than anyone else in his life. If revenge was the motive, Travis may have taken his own life after killing Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia. Many fathers who commit such acts of vengeance don't survive much longer themselves. Of course, only Travis can truly reveal what motivated him. The media has reported that a note was found in his vehicle, but Sheriff Mike Morrison has not confirmed that and says the goal remains to find Travis alive so that he can explain his actions himself. The police released 2 videos to inform the public about what Travis might look like and how he behaved shortly before the tragedy. The first video was captured by a doorbell camera at a residence, showing Travis approaching and attempting to open the door and enter. However, none of the residents knew him. This video was recorded before Travis picked up the girls on May 30th. Additionally, in May 2025, Travis was involved in 2 car accidents, on May 4th and May 27th. He was issued a fine because he did not have insurance. The officer's body camera captured their interaction, where Travis asked several times if he would be arrested and why. The officer patiently answered all his questions, and Travis politely said goodbye and left. Detectives also discovered that by that time, Travis was already struggling with heavy thoughts, because on May 26th, he searched the internet for how to move to Canada, how to immigrate to Canada, and jobs in Canada. This is curious since Canada does not extradite suspects facing the death penalty in their home country. However, Washington state does not have the death penalty, meaning Travis is not at risk of capital punishment here, and Canada would not protect him even if he managed to get there. Moreover, to reach the Canadian border, Travis would have to travel through the mountains, difficult and varied terrain, for several weeks. Is this possible? For an average person, the answer is a clear no. But Travis is not an average person. He is an exception because he knows, is trained, and even enjoys living in such conditions. His father said that Travis sometimes went into the mountains and stayed there for up to 2.5 months. In other words, he knows the area, has studied it, could prepare supplies for himself, and most importantly, has the knowledge to avoid capture for an extended period. He wouldn't be the first fugitive to try to hide in the Washington mountains. In 2020, Jorge Alcantara Gonzalez, wanted for murder and similarly experienced in mountain survival, managed to evade capture for 23 days. On the other hand, this is extremely difficult both psychologically and physically. It's not only about surviving constant police pursuit, but also about finding food. While drinking water can be obtained using modern, lightweight filters, food is more complicated. Travis would either have to carry provisions or hunt, but then he would need to make a fire to cook meat, a fire that would sooner or later give away his position. He could set traps, but that requires staying nearby for some time, waiting for prey, and again, preparing food. Relying solely on wild plants in the mountains is not an option because the heavy physical strain and adrenaline from being chased burn a lot of calories. And without protein, Travis wouldn't last long. Due to these factors, police are not confident they will find him alive. However, as Sheriff Mike Morrison said, they are not ready to rule out any possibilities yet, especially since on June 10th, police may have gotten a lead. Near Blewett Pass, they found an item believed to belong to Travis. Also, a group of hikers reported seeing a lone traveler who appeared poorly equipped for the conditions and seemed to avoid other hikers. Search teams immediately responded by sending a helicopter to the area. The helicopter did spot a lone hiker who left the trail and quickly disappeared when the helicopter flew overhead. Tracking dogs were brought to the spot where he vanished and followed his trail to Ingalls Creek Trail, where it was lost. Then, on the evening of July 1st, police received a tip from a local resident who claimed to have seen Travis near Snoqualmie Pass. If true, Travis covered an enormous distance, nearly 60 kilometers from Leavenworth. Despite the massive search effort, Travis or his body has not been found. A reward of $20,000 is offered for information on his whereabouts. Police do not know if he is armed, but he is definitely considered dangerous. Officers have urged local residents, especially those in remote areas, to lock their homes and outbuildings. If Travis truly wanted to take revenge on Whitney, he chose the most innocent victims for his vengeance. Whitney's lawyer said that even after what happened, Whitney is trying to find sympathy for her ex-husband in her heart. Finding the strength to try to understand after such a tragedy is priceless, and clearly not something everyone can do. The woman explained that Travis repeatedly tried to get help, but it is very difficult for U.S. veterans to obtain services. Also, if the police had agreed to use the Amber Alert system, the girls might still be alive today. That is why Whitney believes the system failed her family, especially her daughters. Whitney is not ready to speak to the press, but did speak at the farewell ceremony for Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia. She shared a family tradition. At the end of each day, they would name 3 feelings they experienced during the day. Peyton always had more than 3 and couldn't stop talking, telling her mother everything. Evelyn preferred to share hers privately with her mom. Olivia was not yet able to fully describe what she felt, but one of her constant feelings was happiness. Whitney encouraged everyone to adopt this sweet, kind, and joyful tradition in memory of her 3 daughters, whom she lost in one day because they were all so different, yet each incredible in her own way. Autumn Page Strickland was racing down the street, gasping for breath. Behind her, her own car was chasing her, and at the wheel sat a stranger. Who was he? What did he want? Thoughts whirled through her mind, but no answers came, and there was no time to find them. She had to save her life. Surveillance cameras captured Autumn's desperate attempt to escape, and what detectives later found on those recordings allowed them to reconstruct the events of that night of sheer terror and to solve the case. What had begun as a missing person case soon turned into an inexplicable story of murder by a stranger, involving a car chase and an attempt to destroy all the evidence in flames. Autumn Page Strickland was born and raised in Florida, where her love for the outdoors first began. She enjoyed fishing, boating, horseback riding, swimming, and sunbathing. During her college years, Autumn moved to Alabama. She earned a degree in advertising at the University of Alabama, where she also met her future husband, Jeffrey Strickland. The couple married on January 2, 2007, when Autumn was 20 and Jeffrey was 22. That same year, Autumn began working as a property manager in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, overseeing more than 200 real estate properties. In addition, she sold personal training contracts at a fitness center. Autumn worked tirelessly, and despite her young age, she managed to achieve significant success in her career. In 2012, Autumn Page Strickland became the mother of a wonderful baby boy whom she and Jeffrey named Lane. Unfortunately, the couple soon realized they were not right for each other and separated, but both parents adored their son. Autumn was a loving and devoted mother, spending all her free time with him. They went to the beach, played active games, visited the zoo. Autumn did everything she could to fill her son's childhood with happy memories. She never imagined that all too soon those moments would become her most precious memories of him. In mid-April 2017, Lane was rushed to the emergency room. The prognosis was grim. Doctors discovered rhabdomyosarcoma in the 4-year-old's brain. They told Autumn and Jeffrey that this was a rare form of cancer, affecting fewer than 350 people per year. The parents were devastated. It was every parent's worst nightmare. For Autumn, the news was especially shocking, as Lane had always seemed like a healthy, happy child. How could a mother possibly expect something like this when her son was only 4? To make matters worse, their insurance company fought them over covering each medication their son needed, many of which cost more than $550 per week. Friends rallied to help by organizing fundraisers for Lane. Soon, he began both chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Autumn shared a photo of her son in the hospital. He had already lost his beautiful wheat blonde hair and wore a medical mask, but he was surrounded by love. Autumn admitted, "We fight every day, and sometimes it's harder than I'll ever admit to anyone. But I know that without him, there is no me." Like many parents in such a situation, Autumn watched helplessly as her little boy grew weaker, undergoing one procedure after another, clinging to the hope that something might change. But the cancer proved too overwhelming for such a small child. On July 22, 2017, just days before his 5th birthday, Lane passed away, only 2.5 months after the terrible diagnosis. By some miracle, Autumn Page Strickland managed to pull herself together after the loss of her son. She was deeply supported by friends and family who tried to draw the grieving mother out of her home, distract her, and help her regain some sense of normalcy in her life. Autumn herself understood that nothing could bring Lane back and that she had to keep moving forward. But doing so was far harder than simply saying it. She continued to share photos of Lane, often writing beneath them, "Not a minute goes by that I don't miss you. I hate living this life without you." To occupy herself, Autumn threw herself into work. She worked as a realtor and client relations manager. And in 2018, she even launched her own clothing line, named in honor of her son. Soon, Jason Linsman entered Autumn's life, and in 2023, she once again became a mother. This time to Aspen Olivia, an incredibly beautiful little girl. Aspen Olivia had her mother's eyes and bore a striking resemblance to Lane. To Autumn, she became her entire world. But at some point, Autumn and her daughter's father went their separate ways. By 2025, the 38-year-old Autumn was living with her daughter in Florence, Alabama, where she had been renting a house for 2 years and working alongside her mother at a real estate agency. She was planning to move back to her home state of Florida soon, but until then, she kept herself busy with work, though she still made time to meet up with friends whenever her mother could watch her granddaughter. However, one night changed everything. On May 16, 2025, Autumn had made plans to spend time with friends. It was a Friday evening, and she checked into the Strickland Hotel in downtown Florence, the same city where she lived, because she and her friends had decided to meet at the hotel's bar. That's where the group spent a wonderful evening together. They left the bar at around 1:50 a.m. and walked toward their cars, which were parked near the hotel. Autumn also needed to head to her car, and afterward, she likely would have driven home to her daughter, who was staying with her mother that night. But Autumn never made it. She disappeared. After that night, her friends and family were unable to reach her. Of course, she couldn't have just dropped everything and run away. She would never have abandoned her beloved daughter. Worry quickly grew, and early on Sunday, May 18th, when Autumn still hadn't appeared, she was officially reported missing. Her friends took to social media, sharing where Autumn had last been seen and what she was wearing: denim shorts, a black tank top, and flip-flops. But no one had spotted her, despite the fact that she vanished in the middle of downtown, an area often filled with University of Alabama students, since the campus is nearby and the district is full of bars, restaurants, and other popular spots to spend time. Since police knew exactly where Autumn had last been seen, they began reviewing surveillance footage. They spotted her on video just before 2 a.m. on May 17th, leaving the Strickland Hotel with her friends. She was wearing the same clothes her friends later described when she was reported missing. After saying goodbye, Autumn walked toward the parking lot where her car was parked. But the next camera police obtained captured a chilling scene. Autumn was running down the street near the hotel, clutching her phone in her hand. She was sprinting as if someone were chasing her. And indeed, moments later, headlights emerged from the darkness behind her. A car was following directly after her. Investigators were stunned to realize that the vehicle pursuing Autumn was her own car, a green 2012 Kia Soul. The car did not slow down. It struck Autumn, knocking her to the ground. Then the driver turned the vehicle around and ran over her a second time, as if to make sure the injuries were fatal. After that, the driver fled the scene in Autumn's car, leaving her motionless body on the road. The incident bore no resemblance to an accidental hit and run. It was the deliberate murder of Autumn Strickland. Detectives quickly examined the scene of the crime. They discovered Autumn's phone on the sidewalk. Her Kia Soul was later found abandoned about 2 kilometers from where she had been struck. If the perpetrator had killed her, ditched the car, and stopped there, he might never have been caught. But it seemed his plan for Autumn's nightmare that night wasn't over. The same camera captured what happened next. About half an hour later, another vehicle approached the victim's body, which still lay on the sidewalk. It was a white pickup truck. The truck stopped beside her. A tall, dark-haired man stepped out, lifted Autumn, dead or dying, placed her in the truck, and drove away. By Tuesday, May 20th, investigators had gathered enough evidence to identify and locate a potential suspect. He turned out to be a local resident, 28-year-old Logan Michael Rogers. Early that morning, police obtained an arrest warrant and went to his home. He lived just 6 minutes from the hotel where Autumn had met her friends. Parked outside his house was the very same white pickup truck that investigators had seen on the surveillance footage. Since Autumn had not yet been found, Rogers was initially charged with attempted murder, and his bond was set at $1 million. A search of his home followed. The house appeared neglected, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. But the most horrifying discovery was not inside the house, but on the property. A burn barrel, showing clear signs of a recent fire. The blaze had been used to destroy a human body. It still needed to be officially confirmed that the remains belonged to Autumn, but everyone already knew what the answer would be. Logan had not only run over his victim twice with her own car, but had also burned her body. Neighbors were shocked. The thought that a young woman had been incinerated in a barrel just a few yards from their homes was almost too much to comprehend. As soon as Logan's name and photo became public, people began asking who he was and what connection he had to Autumn. How did he end up in her car? Why did he run her over? There was speculation that the two had been a couple, but Autumn's friends were quick to insist she had never dated him. In fact, they had never even seen this man before. Many in Florence knew Logan and his family, and those who were acquainted with him were stunned to learn that he had been arrested in connection with such a horrific crime. People remembered him as a high school football star. Back then, he was very popular, often written about in local newspapers for his athletic achievements. Unsurprisingly, he was also popular with girls. In 2016, Logan met the woman who would later become his wife. After their wedding, she gave birth to their son in 2023. Logan also ran his own business, offering lawn care, landscaping, and groundskeeping services. On the surface, he appeared to be a successful man. He should have been enjoying life, not attacking a stranger. So why did he commit murder? Because the image of a successful businessman, happy father, and devoted husband was just that, an image. In reality, Logan had changed drastically in recent years, and the reason lay partly in his use of illicit substances. They had destroyed the lives of many good people before him, and Logan too had become their victim. Logan was first arrested for marijuana possession at the age of 20. He later claimed he didn't actually have any on him, but he still served 3 years in prison. At 27, he got caught again when a patrol officer discovered cannabis in his possession during a traffic stop. In 2023, around the time his son was supposed to be born, Logan was arrested for public intoxication, and at that time his wife had obtained a restraining order against him. But Logan didn't reform, quite the opposite. In January 2025, he was arrested again in connection with domestic violence. He had threatened his parents, Teresa and Mike, saying he would kill them. Both his mother and wife subsequently obtained restraining orders. Teresa admitted she was genuinely afraid of her son because even the smallest provocation could set him off. If his own parents were not safe, who could be? Certainly not Autumn, but Logan had begun hunting for victims even before Autumn. He prowled the area near the University of Alabama in Florence, seeking attractive young women he could approach and, using various tricks, convince to go home with him. 3 weeks before Autumn's murder, in roughly the same area where she would later be run over, Logan tried to lure another young woman into his schemes, Trinity Bradley, a student at the University of North Alabama. Trinity had spent the evening with friends and, while returning to her dorm, encountered Logan, whom she initially assumed was a student. He pulled up in his white pickup truck, slightly rolled down the window, and asked if he could use her phone. He explained that he was running out of gas and only needed to make a single call. Trinity willingly approached the truck to hand him the phone. But as soon as she did, Logan revealed that he had only stopped because he found her attractive. He wanted her to give him her phone number. Feeling uncomfortable, Trinity politely refused and tried to walk away, not expecting what would happen next. Logan got out of the truck, approached her from behind, and grabbed her with both arms. Fortunately, Trinity managed to free herself but panicked. The stranger had clearly crossed a line. She hurried up the stairs to her dorm, with Logan following closely behind. Trinity cleverly hid her phone under her waistband and secretly began recording him. Meanwhile, Logan was spouting some unconvincing nonsense. He claimed he wanted to show her something. He asked her to come to his house just to sit and talk, saying he wanted to show her everything he knew. Naturally, she refused. She didn't even know who he was. Trinity took a few steps up the stairs and told him to stop harassing women in that way. He replied that it was just a hug. Luckily, he then left her alone. However, the encounter unnerved Trinity enough that she reported him to campus police. Officers were unable to locate him that night. He had likely already left. After speaking with a campus officer, Trinity decided not to press charges, hoping he would continue to be monitored. She assumed he had experienced a temporary lapse in judgment and chose to move on. 3 weeks later, she saw his face in the news in connection with the murder of a young woman in the same area where he had harassed her. It was clear that Logan's crimes were escalating until the irreversible occurred. He had gone on the hunt, and he didn't care who the victim would be. After all, he didn't know Autumn any more than he had known Trinity. It is still unclear exactly what happened in the parking lot when Autumn approached her car. Logan obviously could not have been waiting for her there, since he didn't know her and therefore didn't know which car she drove. But it can be assumed that something similar to what happened with Trinity occurred. He may have noticed her, waited until she was alone, and tried to convince her to give him a ride home. He didn't shy away from tricks like running out of gas or needing to use someone's phone. Perhaps Autumn believed him, or perhaps she refused. But this time he was far more determined. He attacked her, took her car keys, caught up with her, and ran her over twice. Then he began doing things that defy logic. Logan left the victim lying on the ground, but fled in her car. He abandoned the stolen vehicle and found a way to return home, possibly calling someone for a ride or asking online if anyone would give him a lift for money, as he had done before. In any case, he went home, grabbed his pickup truck, and returned to the crime scene about half an hour later. It was the middle of the night, yet surprisingly, no one found the body, despite the fact that it was downtown, an area frequently populated by students and cars. Nevertheless, under the cover of night, Logan placed the girl in his pickup and drove home. He then lit a fire in a burn barrel and disposed of the body. One can only hope she was already dead at that point and that he did not burn her alive. Most likely, Logan's intent was a savage attempt to destroy evidence. Ironically, he only made the police's job easier by appearing on surveillance footage in his white pickup truck. The day after his arrest and the search, May 21st, 2025, Logan appeared in court. The prosecutor requested that he not be released on bail, and the judge agreed. Logan is currently in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution is considering seeking the maximum penalty. In Alabama, prosecutors can request the death penalty if a murder is committed under aggravating circumstances, such as kidnapping or during the commission of another crime, like robbery. Thus, if Logan is found guilty, which seems highly likely, he will either spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death. Another tragic aspect of this case is that at the time of the attack on Autumn, Logan was already awaiting trial for threats against his parents. The judge likely understood that Logan's criminal behavior was escalating, but still allowed him to be released on bail. Had the judge decided to keep him in jail, Autumn might still be alive today, and her daughter would not have lost her mother. Unfortunately, in this case, there are far too many what-ifs. What if the judge had not released him on bail? What if Trinity had pressed charges? What if Autumn had returned to Florida a little earlier? Everything could have turned out differently. Because Logan had been popular with girls in school, he was used to getting what he wanted. He felt like a hero on the football field, surrounded by beautiful girls dreaming of going to prom with him. Combined with his narcissistic personality and drug use, it was a recipe for disaster. Logan believed that women owed him something. One evening, he decided he had the right to hunt them down. It didn't matter who the victim would be. He had no specific target, just a brutal, senseless attack on a girl who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.